In 1585, a man named Nicholas Sander published a book titled Rise and Growth of the Anglican Schism. The pro-Catholic work that is so painfully biased contains the famous grotesque imagery given of Anne Boleyn that many know today. The ardently pro-Catholicism work that gave Nicholas the historian given nickname Slanders was negative towards Anne Boleyn for the part she played in the break England took from Rome. His painfully biased biographical section of Anne is unlikely to be accurate due to himself having never met Anne, both being less than 10 years old and located on the other side of the country at the time of her demise. Contains the infamous claims of her sixth finger, bucked tooth, jaundiced complexion, and big ugly wen, what we in modern day would call a boil or growth, sometimes even cyst, on her neck which forced her to wear high collars. He also described her as with dark hair and eyes that made her seem as sinister as possible. Whilst many other claims have been debunked over the centuries, there is one still debated about today. That is, of her hair. We all have an image that comes to mind when one asks you to picture Anne Boleyn, for there has been many an actress who have played her, dark hair, dark eyes that were said to hook you. But what if I were to tell you that history has given a different answer, that those dark locks were in fact an auburn, not as bright as her daughter's, but the dark russet that borders between red and brown, depending on the lighting, that is common even to this day. We have no known contemporary artwork of Anne. The closest in date to the time she was alive was artwork commissioned in the Elizabethan era, when Anne's daughter sat on the throne. Before Anne's little neck was severed, Henry had already begun removing all trace of the woman he tore a nation apart for. Indeed, even the most nearest contemporary painting we have is a copy of an original that has since been lost. Paintings of Anne with dark locks, painted in later eras, such as the Victorian, are not said to be taken for accuracy. It is known that different periods favoured different aesthetics. The Victorians, for example, saw women with dark hair as being earthy and sensual, as opposed to the delicate blonde English rose. So even if inaccurate, Anne would still have been depicted in most works with black hair. That being said, let us take a look at some of the evidence that potentially dictate the argument against the common dark lock depiction. The first is common information of the Tudor life and an example of a similar individual. In the modern day world, we are used to seeing the world clearly. Electricity has allowed us to use light to brighten up our world. Yet we do see an echo of what the past would have experienced. The warmth of a yellow light bulb and the bright white of an LED have a significant effect on the world around us. They shade our images in colour, and to the human eye we see a different hue. The same can be said for the sun in comparison to artificial light. Now, back in the era of the Tudors, they did not have the same light we use today. All of their light would have come from one or two sources: natural sunlight, of varying strength depending on the day, and light from fire. Now fire is a very warm light, but also, unlike a light bulb, gives room for the abundance of shadows. Even today, if one was to turn out every light and sit in a room with only light from some form of fire as your source, you would see that room in a very different set of shading and colouring compared to the day. The rich grand palaces of the medieval kingdom of England either came in stone or rich wood. Wood which is also known for absorbing light, leading to alcoves bathed in shadow and rooms of pitch black without flame. Halls for entertainment and court had great vaulted windows, such as those at Hampton Court, to bring in as much light as possible. The effect of the lighting of inside the palaces can impact a painting can be seen in this great example. Elizabeth of York was known for her red locks. much like her granddaughter, who bore the same name. But through portraiture, it would seem none of her children inherited the red. Some scholars and ambassadors describe Henry with red hair, but all his portraits have him with brown. His younger sister, Mary, who for a time was Queen of France, has one contemporary painting we know of. This painting depicts Mary Tudor and her husband, Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. In it we see Mary with a dark head of hair, standing beside her husband. This wedding portrait was painted in 1516, so is as contemporary as it comes. Yet her hair colour is wrong. In this locket holds an actual piece of Mary's hair, taken from her tomb in the 18th century, and hair, although can lighten and turn white, grey and silver with age, does not completely change colour naturally. The princess who died at the age of 37 bore the same hair colour as her mother, a similar one to her niece Elizabeth. Other evidence to support the lock of hair are manuscripts from her time as queen that show red hair. Funny how much a bit of lighting can change. Next is the word brown, and how it can mean something very different. The only specific depiction or description of Anne's hair specifically that we can find is that from Thomas Wyatt, who describes it as brown. However, what means brown to us may have a completely different meaning during the time of the Tudors. An example of this we can give is auburn. Auburn at the time of the Tudor England meant blonde or whitish at the time, so brown could easily refer to the darker shades of red hair instead of the rich colour we think of today. Henry's preferences. Now, this one is a lot more loose than, say, that of Mary Tudor. Nonetheless, it is an interesting point to think about. Blonde was seen as beautiful in medieval Europe. Women with blonde hair were very desirable for marriage, as blondes were considered to be much more submissive and biddable. It even went so far that some decreed the hair and complexion was seen as the outward manifestation of the goodness of their souls. Darkness broke the mould of Tudor beauty, whereas red did not. Anne with dark hair would have broken the mould of not only beauty standards, but also that of Henry's, like in the modern day where everyone is said to have a type. The same can be said for Henry Tudor. Henry VIII's many wives and mistresses all had similar hair colours, and none of them were dark. Anne's own sister Mary Boleyn, once lover and in some cases one of his most famous mistresses, is usually taken to have been blonde. Catherine of Aragon, Anne's predecessor on the throne, is depicted in portraits of her youth to have strawberry blonde hair. Jane Seymour is usually taken for being a blonde, from the paleness of her eyebrows in paintings, and her being described as an English rose, blonde being a key feature in such depictions. Anne of Cleves is partially a mystery, as her hair does not feature in any painting, but her sister was a red gold and her brother was a light brown, or what we would call a light brown, so she could have possibly been an auburn as well. Catherine Howard, cousin to Anne Boleyn, was a redhead, and it is likely Catherine Parr was a blonde. The other famous mistress, Bessie Blount, was also a blonde, with the only woman potentially a modern-day brunette being the so-called lucky one, as Henry found her ugly. It could be argued that Anne Boleyn was more fair-haired as to be seen as desirable. Now, on to the nitty-gritty, the paintings. There is one painting, one ring, and two sketches that historians have either identified as Anne Boleyn or strongly suspected it is Anne with red hair. The painting is a depiction made on a similar date to the one in the National Portrait Gallery, the most famous Holbein painting. This second painting is a less well-done recreation of likely the original painting. The likeliness of her face is wrong, and so is most likely a failed attempt, but she is depicted with hair more commonly associated with her daughter, though this could have easily been intentional. Next up is the checkers ring. called that due to the fact it resides in the collection at Chequers. Legend has it that this ring was removed from the hand or bedside of Elizabeth I upon her death by the grandson of Mary Boleyn. He then took it up to Scotland to King James as proof the Queen was dead. Within this ring contains 2 enamel portraits. One is of Elizabeth I and the bust iconic to a number of similar ones. The other is of a woman in a French hood. The fashion style choices are from those of the early 1500s, when Henry VIII was on the throne, and Elizabeth was either not born or very young. The woman in this portrait is seen to have reddish hair. Historians debate between whether this individual is Catherine Parr or Anne Boleyn as the woman, but we do know that Elizabeth showed homage to her mother in many subtle ways. It should be also taken into account that these portraits remain concealed. The image of Catherine Parr was not one Elizabeth needed to hide. For her portrait to be located in a ring Elizabeth rarely removed seemed like a fitting tribute to her mother, who she couldn't show the portraiture of as she could Catherine Parr. Now, there are 2 Holbein the Younger sketches, which at one time or another have been identified as Anne Boleyn. Both of these sketches are located in the Royal Collection, whereas the sketch of the woman in the hood and no hair showing is no longer believed to be Anne. The more informal sketch, likely taken during a pregnancy, is currently identified as Anne. Anne was a frequent client of Holbein and is known to have repeatedly sat for him. It would not be unlikely that some of these sittings took place in more casual attire, for the chambers, excluding the bedchambers of the royals, were rather open to members of the court. Even Henry VIII was known to entertain people in his nightwear. This sketch of Anne, whilst informal, does have one crucial splash of colour, that being her hair. In this sketch, although a slightly darker shade, was similar in colour to that of her daughter. Most accounts of Anne Boleyn's description describe more her personality than her appearance, the only major physical feature mentioned being that of her dark eyes. These quotes include in no particular order the following: "She was so graceful you would never take her for an Englishwoman, but for a Frenchwoman born, the fairest and most bewitching of all the dames of the French court. Her eyes, which she well knew how to use, in truth such was their power that many a man paid his allegiance. She was eloquent and gracious and reasonably good-looking. Not one of the handsomest women in the world, she is of middling stature, swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, a bosom not much raised, and eyes which are black and beautiful. Albeit in beauty she was to many inferior, but for behaviours, manners, attire, and tongue she excelled them all, for she had been brought up in France. Her witty, seductive, intelligent nature seems to have won out over her beautiful but not a beauty features. We may one day learn the truth of this alluring woman's true features, but either way, this alluring figure will still grip the minds of people today in death as she did so in life. To support this channel, please do not forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below, and I will see you all in the next one.